Welcome to Afra's Artifacts, where we do some archaeology of our own and dig into the queer side of Star Wars. I'm your host, Alia Morgaine, and it's so great to have you here. Well, today we are talking about Kaeden Larte from E.K. Johnston's Ahsoka novel. And before I get into her story, I'll be talking a little bit about Tales of the Jedi, so we'll get into that a little bit. But I do want to say this is going to be a multi-part series on Kaeden, because there's a lot to tell. And next week's episode will not be part 2. Next week's episode will be episode 100! So I'm super excited about that. 100 episodes, so crazy. That episode will feature a lovely panel of some wonderful people talking about queer Star Wars, and I cannot wait to show it to y'all. So I'm excited about that, clearly. But let's go ahead and dig into Kaeden Larte's story. So let's jump a little bit back and talk about Tales of the Jedi. So, as y'all know, I'm a little behind on things, so I finally caught up with Tales of the Jedi. Okay, the first thing I want to say is that every episode of that freaking show is killer. But Ahsoka's story in the very last episode is highly conflated. And that is an issue, and I struggle with it. I don't know why they had to do it that way. I guess because the other story was in book form and they wanted to show it in media form, but I don't really understand the driving force for having to show it. Like, why did they even have to show that part of Ahsoka's life? I don't quite understand. So, what am I talking about? What in the world am I talking about? Well, both Tales of the Jedi, I'm talking about the last episode of Tales of the Jedi. So that episode and the Ahsoka novel both involve a farming settlement and what appear to be a sibling pair. Both have an inquisitor. Both have an evacuation of farming villagers that involves Bail Organa. Both have Ahsoka being determined at the end to not give up the fight. So, after I first watched it, I was like, oh, well, this could have taken place, before Ahsoka went to Raada. Yeah, that doesn't work because Ahsoka was not determined to not give up the fight until after what happened on Raada. So that doesn't work. And then it's like, oh, but maybe this happens after Raada. No, that can't work either because Ahsoka announces to Bail Organa that she is now Fulcrum at the end of the Ahsoka novel. So, yeah, it's a conflation of two stories. There's really no way to separate them. It's one or the other, unfortunately. You could say it's a different point of view, but I don't really think so. It's just two different stories. So that is highly unfortunate because in the Ahsoka novel, we get Kaeden Larte, who is a fabulous woman of color who is attracted to Ahsoka. Like, oh my gosh, she is this spunky, humorous, really confident girl, and she's pretty darn great. So not including her in Tales of the Jedi is pretty heartbreaking, honestly. So let's get into a little bit about Kaeden. So first let's talk about Raada. Raada is a small moon, and it's out of the way even by Outer Rim standards. It only has one resource, which is its crop, and only one major settlement. I'm saying this moon is tiny. Very tiny. And when Ahsoka meets Kaeden, Ahsoka is standing in front of a house in a neighborhood with smaller houses that have been cobbled together with no sense of aesthetic. Ahsoka is seeing if she might want to live in it. Well, Kaeden walks up behind her and says, "There's no one in it." And then it goes on to describe Kaeden. It says, a girl about Ahsoka's age, but with more lines around her eyes. Looked like she worked outside all the time and had weathered skin to show for it. Her eyes were sharp, but not vicious. She was lighter than Master Windu, but darker than Rex. And she had more hair than both of them combined. Not that that was difficult. Braided into brown lines, neatly out of her way and secured behind her head. She sounds gorgeous. But we'll get into why she is so spunky. So Kaeden gives Ahsoka her first job. Ahsoka goes by Ashla, and she says that she's a mechanic and she will fix things. And so Kaeden brings her a pile of scrap that used to be a thresher she says she recently lost a fight with. So Ahsoka's response is, I'd hate to see what happens when you win fights. And then Kaeden says, it was not my fault. One moment we were cruising along, set to make quota and everything, and the next thing I knew, disaster. And then Ahsoka, in her thoughts, it says, Ahsoka was used to the way clones told war stories, but Kaeden could have given them a run for their credits. To hear her tell it, the thresher had suddenly developed sentience and objected to its lot as a farming implement. And only Kaden's quick thinking and heavy boots had prevented it from taking over the galaxy. And then Kaeden says, to wrap up the story, and when it finally stopped moving, my sister pointed out that I was bleeding. I said it was only fair, since the thresher was bleeding oil, but then I passed out a little bit. So I guess it was worse than I thought. I woke up in medical with this fancy bandage and this stupid machine in a tray beside my cot. So I love her way of telling stories. I love her way of speaking. I think she sounds like a really enjoyable person to be around. And then at one point, Kaeden says, I'm good at convincing people to leave you alone. So she's definitely confident. She's very confident in herself. And then it starts to get into a little bit about Kaeden and Ahsoka's relationship. So how they see each other. And Ahsoka's thoughts. It says, Kaeden had already begun to ask leading questions, hinting that she'd like to learn more about where Ashla had come from and what she did when she disappeared from town. Ahsoka did her best to change the subject. The hard part was that Ahsoka found she actually wanted to talk to Kaeden and tell her all sorts of things. They didn't have any life experiences in common, but Kaeden was a good listener, even though neither of them could solve the other's problems. Moreover, talking to someone who was mostly untroubled by the largeness of the galaxy helped Ahsoka focus, and she was having trouble with that sort of thing these days, even when she tried to meditate. So clearly, Ahsoka and Kaeden start to develop a close relationship with each other, even though Kaeden knows nothing about Ahsoka, to be honest. Nothing about Ashla. Ahsoka's very vague. She at one point says she was adopted and comes up with other random spurts of brilliance that just make life harder for her. But, so all that is happening, and then the Empire arrives, and that will continue on to the next episode on Kaeden Larte. But before I leave, I do want to just share this little snippet about Kaden's childhood, just to give some background context to her life. So she says, my parents settled us here when I was 4 and Miara was 1. They died in the accident that cut up Zelda so bad. But I was 14 by then, and just old enough to draw a wage. Vartan took me on because of my circumstances, even though everyone else thought I was too young. Then he took Miara on, too. And at one point, Kaeden does talk about how she kind of regrets the fact that, not that there's much she could have done about it, but she does kind of regret the fact that Miara had to follow in her footsteps so closely. That she had to start working so soon. Because at this point, Kaeden is 17 and Miara is 14. and just the fact that she basically had to start working super young and wasn't able to really have much of a childhood, which is really sad. So that is the beginning of Kaeden Larte's story as it intermingles with Ahsoka's, and she was so worthy to be on screen. I don't understand why Tales of the Jedi didn't either just choose a totally different story for Ahsoka for that last episode. I don't get it. But it is a huge bummer that there is a boy and girl. I'm assuming they're siblings. They're both white. Instead of having these two fabulous sisters of color, it's very frustrating. And it makes me wonder sometimes what in the world people in the writer's room are thinking. Because you had this fabulous woman that you could have included in Tales of the Jedi, and you did not. But, yeah. So, we will continue Kaeden Larte in a future episode. But remember, next week is episode 100. And there will be a panel of fans talking about queer Star Wars. So check that out. And comment down below on what you think about this whole Tales of the Jedi fiasco. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me on Twitter at Alia Morgaine, and peruse my blog at thestarwarsreview.blogspot.com. May the Force be with you.